My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. Let's dive right into today's topic, ancient Chinese poetry, specifically the Shijing. I'm going to be doing a short 4-part series on the Shijing, the classic of poetry. Rob and I did a podcast on the Shijing's first poem, Guan Guan Cries the Osprey. Check that out. That's from October 9th, 2021. But for this series, we'll be doing different poems. Okay, let's first talk about the Shijing. How do you even translate this? What is the name of this collection of works? It's been translated in a bunch of different ways. The classic of poetry, the book of poetry, the book of songs, the classic of song. Which one is the correct translation? Yes! In fact, all of these translations are decent translations for a concept that doesn't really map onto the English language super well. For the purpose of me talking about it, I know a lot of my listeners are studying Chinese or interested in China enough that they sometimes like it when I use the Chinese word, so I'm just going to call it the Shijing. What is the Shijing? The Shijing is the first book of poetry that we have extant in the Chinese language. It's one of the earliest collections of lyric poetry in the world. It's hard to exaggerate how important the Shijing is. When you read classical Chinese works, they quote from the Shijing all the flippin' time. In fact, if you ever have a time machine and go back to the Han Dynasty and want to convince someone of something, you ought to just quote a bunch of stuff from the Shijing. You don't have to be right. You can have a stupid idea, but as long as you quote something from the Shijing, it will take your dumb idea and make it seem more reasonable. It's the same thing as for my daughter adding sprinkles to any kind of food. As soon as she sees those sprinkles, she goes, "Ooh, that looks good." All kinds of writers are quoting the Shijing throughout this period. Why is it so important? It's important because it's old, and by old, I mean real old. The collection probably came together sometime around 600 BC, but the poems themselves are older. The Shijing, in the form that we have it today, has 305 poems. Guan Guan Cries the Osprey is number 1. Each of the poems have numbers associated with them. Oh, where did those numbers come from? So, sometime in the Han Dynasty, that is the dynasty running from 202 BC to 220 AD. Yes, if you are dyslexic, that will be troubling to remember. The Han Dynasty, there was this guy, his name, Master Mao, Mao Zi. We don't know much about him. We don't even know if that's really his real name, but that's the name by which he is remembered. He organized this poetry collection and he wrote commentaries on these poems. And he is the one that gives us this number system that we still sometimes use today. Also, I should point this out. I'm going to hammer this home again and again and again during the series. We have to rely on him and some of the other commentaries who are writing in the Han Dynasty or, about 2,000 years ago. We have to rely on them to understand these poems because the language in these poems is just so archaic. It's so freaking old. It's so different from the classical Chinese of the Han Dynasty that it's impossible for me or your average Chinese reader today to pick them up and read these poems on our own. When I say archaic, let me give you an example. Today's poem is Fat Rat. Big Rat. I'm translating it as Fat Rat, but it could just as easily be Big Rat. In Chinese, now if you go and check out the website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com, I'm going to put the poem, both my translation and the original Chinese, up on the website. If you go out and check out the title, if you speak Chinese, you'll notice that the title means something probably more like hard rat in modern Chinese. It's not Fat Rat, it's not Big Rat, it's hard rat. How do we know that the ying in the poem's title really means something like big or fat rather than what it means today in modern Chinese and what it meant in classical Chinese 2,000 years ago, and that is hard? The only reason we know is because that's what the commentaries tell us. These commentaries by guys like Master Mao, they say, actually, this doesn't mean hard, it means da, it means big. Are they right? We have no way of knowing. The poems that we have today are entirely filtered through these experts from 2,000 years ago. And this is a language that's 3,000 years old. We don't know whether or not they are right. We have no way of being certain. All of our understanding of the content of the poem has to be filtered through these guys like Master Mao. And yet at the same time, we have to be questioning, okay, they have motives for telling us that this poem actually means this. But is that really what it means? We can never be certain if they're not being honest with us, but we always have to be critical when we're looking at these commentaries. Even if we are critical, I can't emphasize this enough. You cannot just pick up these poems and read them. In order to read these poems, you have to have someone to tell you how to read them. Let me say that again. In order to read these poems, you have to have someone tell you how to read them. So all of your ideas about you as a reader coming to a poem, interpreting it, throw that out the window. You have to read the commentaries. You can distrust the interpretations that the commentaries have. And in later episodes, I'll talk about some of my distrust of the commentators and why I think they get the message wrong. But in the end, you can't be certain of whether or not they're right or wrong because our understanding of the poem itself is entirely filtered through commentators like Master Mao. Now, Master Mao is not the only important person to have a role in the collection of the Shijing. Legend has it that Confucius himself chose the poems that are to be included in the collection. And legend has it that the way he arranged them had a special meaning, so that when we read it, we should interpret that in mind. So the first poem is particularly important. Why? Because Confucius put it there himself. Now, y'all will notice that these things are a contradiction. Either Master Mao arranged it and gave us the numbering order that we have, or Confucius arranged it. The truth is, we don't really know much about how this poetry collection was created, so we just have to go with these legends and these commentators. We have no evidence that Confucius had anything to do with the creation of this poetry collection, though we do know he actually read it because, again, he's quoting from it like everybody else was. I think it's probably a legend that he had anything to do with its creation. I think it was just some folks in the Han Dynasty who were like, Confucius is really important. The Shijing is really important. Therefore, they must have something to do with one another. But again, that's just my guess. Okay, all of that is way too much exposition. Too much tell, not enough show. Let me get to the poem of this episode. The poem that we're going to look at today, as I mentioned before, is called Fat Rat. Here is my translation. Fat rat, don't eat my millet. I have served you for so long, but you have not taken care of me. I swear I'm going to leave you. I'm going to take off for that other happy land. Happy land, happy land. That is where I'm going to be. Fat rat, don't eat my wheat. I have served you for so long, but you ain't done me any favors. I swear I'm going to leave you. I'm going to take off for that happy country. Happy country, happy country. That is where I'll find my reward. Fat rat, don't eat my seedlings. I have served you for so long, but you still haven't given me anything in return. I swear I'm going to leave you. I'm going to take off for that happy suburb. Happy suburb, happy suburb. Oh man, sigh. As usual, I'm going to put my translation along with the original Chinese up on the website, ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. Please check that out if you're interested. Okay, let's dive into the poem. First, you'll notice this poem is very repetitive. A lot of poems from the Shijing are super repetitive. Some of them were probably old folk songs sung by farmers in the field. That includes this poem. Second, on a very basic level, this poem is about a rat that keeps eating the farmer's crops. The farmer threatens to go away from the rat if he keeps doing this. Okay, pretty simple, right? Except that if we just take this poem at its simple face value, and there's something that kind of, I don't know, it doesn't make sense. If the farmer's threatening to just move away, if the rat doesn't stop eating too much of his crops, it's weird that the farmer's only recourse is to threaten to move away. Rats are everywhere that there are farms. There is no place that has a farm that doesn't have a rat. They are one of the most successful mammals on the planet. They live on every continent other than Antarctica, and they have colonized vast swaths of everywhere from Siberia to Tierra del Fuego. If you are an ancient Zhou dynasty farmer, you ain't getting away from rats. So what is this poem really about? Well, there's an interpretation of this poem. The rat is supposedly a metaphor for government officials, and the rat nibbling at part of the crop is actually a metaphor for an official taking too much of his taxes. Okay, now if we think about this poem through this interpretation, suddenly it makes a little bit more sense. That line, "I have served you for so long," makes a bit more sense to me to think of this as a supplicant offering his taxes to a greedy government official. And also that threat of picking up and moving to another land, that makes a bit more sense too. Mencius and other Chinese philosophers talk about this thing when a king asks them what good governance and bad governance is all about. These philosophers will talk about, well, the evidence for whether or not you're doing a good or bad job of governing is whether or not farmers are getting up and moving to another country when things in their home country are going not so well. So if farmers are moving into your country, that means you're doing a good job. If farmers are moving out of your country, that means you're not doing a good job and probably your taxes are way too rapacious. How do we know this interpretation might be correct? Well, actually, it's the interpretation that Master Mao offers. Here's what Master Mao's commentary says. The fat rat, this is satirizing heavy collection of taxes. The person of the country is satirizing the lord of the country for heavy taxation, nibbling at regular folks, 老百姓, not mending his governance, being corrupt, and making people afraid, just like a big rat. In other words, according to Master Mao, this poem is not so much about a rodent. Rather, it's a satire of big government in ancient China and the threat of the state to the average farmer. Okay, so in this episode, we looked at one of the most important poems in the Shijing. In the next episode, I'll talk about a different poem. This poem is about a pretty peach and a pretty young girl. Stick around for that. For this episode's Chengyu, I was not able to find any Chengyu related to this specific poem, but there's actually a Chengyu related to another rat in the Shijing. The Chengyu is Gu Chu Fu Shu. It just means a lowly person or thing, someone you don't have to care about or consider. Well, that's kind of mean, actually, both to the people who this Chengyu would describe and to the rats. You should always be thinking about common folks and rats. Don't look down on them. Well, anyways, that's just my thinking. And that is where I'm going to call it. If you like or don't like this podcast, send me an email, ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. If you do want to support the podcast, consider going to Patreon, Chinese Literature Podcast at patreon.com. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast.